Some stories carry a mystery that seems greater than life itself, as if time and chance conspire to leave a trail of questions we may never know how to answer. This account takes us back to a time marked by farewells and unexpected encounters, when a family sought a way to preserve the face of someone they deeply loved in their memory. However, what seemed to be just an attempt to hold on to memories ended up revealing something no one could have foreseen. Good evening, Dom. My name is Francisco. I'm writing to share a story that has followed my family for generations, something that has made us question what we truly know about the world around us. This story takes us back to the early years of the 2000s. I wasn't born yet, but they say it was around that time my grandmother passed away. Her death deeply shook the entire family, as she was very beloved and uniquely kind. There was, however, a striking detail. None of her 6 children had a photo of her. They didn't want to say goodbye without keeping something that could remind them of her presence. So they decided to take photographs using a camera from that era, as camera phones weren't common yet, or if they were, their quality was poor. The first photo they took was of my grandmother's face in her coffin. The second image was taken at the request of my uncle Marcos. It showed the coffin in the center, and in the background, 3 of her children. Shortly after taking the picture, they held the wake and burial at the nearest cemetery. At that time, photos had to be developed to be seen. Because of this, my mother took the film to the closest store, where it took about 3 days to process. When the photos were finally ready, something unusual appeared. In the second photograph, the one showing the coffin and her 3 children, you could clearly see a translucent figure resembling my grandmother's silhouette, standing right in the center between them. While some uncles believed it was just a camera defect or a trick of the imagination affected by grief, my mother and other relatives swore the figure was truly her. At first, the days went on without major changes, but everything shifted when one of my uncles began having dreams about my grandmother. He reported seeing her during episodes of sleep paralysis, that state where, as you're falling asleep, it feels like something is holding you down, preventing you from moving. This same dream recurred for weeks until, one night, the reports suddenly stopped. Shortly after, his body was found at the bottom of a ravine. The cause of death was a heart attack. The shock of the loss was enormous, but the family barely had time to recover before another uncle, who was also in the photograph, began experiencing the same dreams. Like his brother, he saw their mother during sleep paralysis, but with one difference. She seemed extremely angry, her face marked by fury. These dreams persisted for weeks until he, too, died of a heart attack, just like his brother. Once again, a wake and burial were held, and sadness overtook everyone. The sense that something inexplicable was happening began to weigh on the family, as if they were living under a curse. Shortly thereafter, Uncle Marcos, the one who had requested the second photograph, began having the same dreams. He described an intense fear when talking about the visions, which were no longer limited to their grandmother's image. Now she appeared accompanied by the 2 brothers who had already passed away. The grandmother remained furious, while the brothers stood motionless, their expressions empty, devoid of any emotion. As the weeks went by, these dreams became constant, until one night Uncle Marcos left his room to go to the bathroom and never returned. He too died of a heart attack. At the wake, the conversation revolved around everything that had happened. The family discussed the terrifying coincidences, searching for reasons behind so many consecutive losses. Some believed a kind of curse had been triggered by the photograph. Finally, one detail stood out. In the photograph where the grandmother's figure appeared in the background, it was exactly the 3 brothers in the image who died within a span of less than 3 months. To this day, my family believes she was the one who took them. I, on the other hand, have my own theory. Perhaps in some way they really did see her, and maybe that vision was so impactful it caused the heart attacks. That's my story. Good night. Before we move on to the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to get the latest stories. Your presence means a lot, and your support is essential. All right, let's keep going. Good evening, everyone. My name is Marcelo. I've been a truck driver for over 15 years, traveling roads all across the country. I love what I do, but I must admit that the road has its dark side. There are events that happen during trips that defy any rational explanation. One such event, which occurred some time ago, still keeps me awake at night. I can't say for sure if it was something supernatural or just bad luck being in the wrong place at the wrong time, but I know that night completely changed the way I see the highways. I was on a long trip heading south with a load destined for a large store. The night was calm, with no traffic, and everything seemed normal. The stretch I was driving on was a mountain road I knew well, but it always gave me a sense of unease. It's the kind of place where you know that if something goes wrong, no one will come to help until dawn. Around 2 in the morning, something unusual began to happen. The truck suddenly lost power, as if it were climbing a steep hill even though the road was flat. I checked the instruments and everything seemed to be functioning normally. The engine sounded as it always did, but it felt like it lacked the strength to move forward. I thought the weight of the load might be the issue, even though I'd driven that same route before without any problems. I decided to pull over on a curve where there was enough space to stop and investigate. As soon as I stepped out of the truck, I was overwhelmed by an unsettling silence. There was no wind, no sound of crickets or other nocturnal animals typical of the mountains. It was as if the entire environment had been muted. I grabbed my flashlight and checked the engine. Everything was in place with no signs of trouble. I then decided to check the cargo, walking to the trailer to make sure it was securely fastened. When I opened the doors, a chill ran down my spine. The cargo was just as I had left it, but on the floor of the trailer there were handprints in the dust, as if someone had crawled inside. I was certain those marks weren't there at the start of the trip. I quickly closed the trailer, trying to convince myself that the marks were probably left by someone from the loading crew before departure. I got back into the truck and accelerated, determined to leave that stretch of the mountain road as quickly as possible. A heavy, unsettling feeling lingered in the air, and I found myself glancing at the mirrors, hoping not to see anything unusual. A little later, as I entered a sharp curve, I felt something strange in the trailer. It was as if something heavy had shifted inside, accompanied by a dull thud against one of the walls. I immediately stopped the truck abruptly, got out with the flashlight, and cautiously opened the trailer doors to check. This time, what I saw left me frozen. In addition to the handprints, there were now barefoot footprints scattered from one end of the trailer to the other. They were small, resembling those of a child, and were perfectly visible in the dust. I was absolutely certain those footprints weren't there the first time I checked. I climbed back into the truck, gripped by fear, and decided to get out of there as fast as I could. I pressed on the accelerator, trying to push the memory of what I had just witnessed out of my mind, but it felt like the road would never end. No matter how much I drove, the curves seemed to repeat endlessly. I turned on the radio, hoping to distract myself, but all I could hear was static. Occasionally, I glanced at the side mirrors, feeling as though something was moving behind the truck. However, every time I tried to look more clearly, I saw nothing. Until in one of those glances, my blood ran cold. In the right side mirror, something caught my attention. A pale face with black, unblinking eyes staring at me from the rear door of the trailer. For a moment, it felt like my heart stopped. Instinctively, I turned my head to look directly, but all I managed to see was the thing quickly hiding behind the truck, as if it didn't want to be seen. I tried to ignore the mirror, but my peripheral vision still caught glimpses of that unmoving face, as if it were stuck to the glass. I pressed harder on the accelerator, but the truck seemed to resist my effort. The speed wouldn't increase, as if something invisible was holding the vehicle back. Then I heard noises coming from the roof, like footsteps or knocks. I didn't have the courage to look up. I didn't want to find out what was up there. I kept driving with only one prayer in mind, that the road would end as soon as possible. Finally, I saw lights in the distance indicating a small village. Relief washed over me instantly. As soon as I reached the first gas station, I parked, hurriedly got out of the truck, and ran to the convenience store. I needed to see other people, to be in someone's company. The station attendant gave me a strange look, probably thinking I was out of my mind, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to feel less alone. After a few minutes trying to catch my breath, I mustered the courage to check the truck again. The cargo was in place, the doors were closed, and there were no signs of the footprints I had seen earlier. It was as if nothing had happened. However, the silence of that night and the memory of the pale face remained etched in my mind, impossible to erase. To this day, I have no idea what I saw or heard on that road. I only know that there are things in this world that completely escape our understanding. And without a doubt, it's in the most isolated places that these inexplicable situations seem to find us, challenging everything we think we know. Good evening, Dom. My name is Adriel. I've spent my entire life as a farm worker, surrounded by livestock and crops. From a young age, I saved every penny I earned, hoping to buy some cattle and save up to grow corn and other crops. My village was small, and almost everyone lived off agricultural work. The meat sold at the butcher's was always fresh, the eggs came straight from the backyard, and the cheese was made on the spot. That's what I appreciated the most about living there. Everything was authentic. Despite the village's reputation for gossip, I loved riding my bike around the area or swimming in the river with my family. What I want to share today happened when I was asked to watch over a mango orchard a few kilometers from the village near the main highway. It was harvest season, and the owner needed someone to guard the place. His concern was that people from neighboring communities were sneaking in to steal the fruit, causing losses. I had known the owner, Luciano, for years. Our parents were friends, and we had played soccer together a few times on afternoons by the river. When he offered me the job, he explained that there was a structure on the property where I could stay. The building was still unfinished, with no doors or windows, but it had a roof and walls, plus a hammock where I could rest. He assured me it would only be temporary, just during the harvest. The offer was good, and I accepted immediately. Luciano came to pick me up on the first day around 6 in the evening. The sky, painted orange by the sunset, made the journey even more beautiful. As soon as we arrived, I noticed the immensity of the orchard, with endless rows of mango trees. The place was close enough to the highway to hear cars in the distance. Luciano reassured me, saying the area was very quiet at night and that simply making some noise would be enough to scare off potential intruders. According to him, these people were usually not dangerous, just looking for unguarded spots to grab some fruit. My task was to ensure no one got in, patrolling and making noise if necessary. I assured him I would do everything as he had explained. To help me, I brought Teddy, my large dog with a bark that could make anyone think twice before approaching. The afternoon flew by. My mother had prepared a dinner I brought with me, along with some candles and a flashlight to light up the long nights. Before nightfall, I took a walk around the orchard to get familiar with the space. Everything was in order. Inside the structure, the evening breeze was calm and refreshing. I ate dinner there with Teddy by my side, sharing some of the food and even 2 mangoes I had peeled. His presence was comforting, and at that moment, I was certain bringing him along had been a great decision. I lay in the hammock just to rest, but I ended up falling asleep without realizing it. It didn't take long before Teddy's barking woke me up, putting me on high alert. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked, still groggy. He was staring intently outside, where the shadows of the mango trees merged together. The only light came from the 2 candles I had placed in the corners of the house. I got up and followed his gaze, trying to spot something. The only sound I could hear was the rustling of branches in the wind. I pressed the side button on my wristwatch to check the time. It was around 1 in the morning. "Calm down, Teddy," I said, trying to soothe him. He seemed to relax, but remained restless. Even so, I decided to take a look around to make sure everything was fine. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, with Teddy walking ahead of me. He stayed a few meters in front, always alert. I moved slowly, shining the light around. After walking for about 5 minutes, I heard a strange sound, the faint crunch of branches being stepped on. The noise seemed distant, and I had the impression of spaced-out steps, as if someone was taking 2 or 3 steps and stopping. I pointed the flashlight in that direction but saw nothing. I kept moving, lighting up the branches and trees around me. Everything seemed normal. I reached the edge of the orchard near the fence that marked the property's boundary. That's when the footsteps returned, but now they were quicker, as if someone were running. A sense of unease began to grow in me. I stopped and looked at Teddy, who stood with his ears perked, completely still. He seemed to hear something I couldn't. The footsteps now had something strange about them, sounding like multiple sets coming from different directions, but stopping and starting erratically. I swung the flashlight around, illuminating the trunks and branches. That's when I noticed a shadow between the trees. My heart raced as I saw the silhouette of something with horns, which quickly disappeared behind a trunk. I thought it might be a cow, but I couldn't see the rest of its body. I kept pointing the flashlight in the same direction. For a brief moment I saw the horns again, and this time, an eye. But it was too quick, lasting less than a second. Immediately afterward, I heard hurried footsteps, as if whatever it was had moved away. At that moment I felt a strange weight on my shoulders, as if the atmosphere had become oppressive. The silence was absolute. What was even stranger was that Teddy, my loyal companion who usually barked at anything suspicious, didn't make a sound. He seemed paralyzed, perhaps afraid. I won't deny that I was uneasy, but I tried to convince myself it was nothing. It must be a cow or at most a bull, I thought, trying to push away strange ideas. After all, there was no other animal in the area with horns. I decided it was time to head back to the makeshift house. I called Teddy, who quickly came over, almost as if relieved to leave that spot. The walk back felt endless. The tension weighed on my shoulders, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept telling myself to stay calm, but the darkness and silence didn't help. Midway, a loud thud startled me. Something heavy had fallen in the distance. I let out a nervous laugh, trying to push away the fear. I had faced lonelier situations before, so it didn't make sense to feel so scared. When I finally reached the makeshift house, I returned to the hammock. Teddy lay down beside me, as restless as I was. He kept shifting around, which only heightened my anxiety. The fact that the house had no doors made the environment even more unsettling. The shadows of the trees outside seemed to dance, feeding my imagination. Even so, I forced my eyes shut and eventually fell asleep after a long while. At dawn, I woke up to the sounds of nature around me. I shook Teddy, who was curled up by my side, and we decided to take a walk before Luciano arrived. The morning was chilly, and the plants were still covered in dew from the night. I returned to the same spot where I had seen the horns the night before, but in the daylight, everything seemed normal. Even Teddy explored the area without showing any signs of nervousness. This convinced me that it had all been the result of the oppressive nighttime atmosphere and my heightened state of alertness. Shortly after Luciano arrived to pick me up, I told him everything was fine and got into the truck to go back home. There I shared what had happened with my mother, who, like me, thought the shadows and my nerves had played tricks on me. I decided to let it go and took a nap to rest. Later that same afternoon, Luciano returned. He came into the house, greeted my parents, and then we went back to the orchard together. As soon as we arrived, still in daylight, I did another inspection of the property. I decided to explore beyond the fence and discovered a stream a few meters away. It wasn't very deep, but Teddy enjoyed splashing his paws in it for a moment. When the sun set, the atmosphere changed drastically. The same place that had felt so peaceful during the day became heavy and desolate. The air seemed denser, and even Teddy, usually carefree, seemed to sense the difference. Despite this, I lay in the hammock and, despite the tension, quickly fell asleep. Hours later, a voice woke me up. "Good evening." It echoed in the darkness repeatedly. It was a male voice, calm yet disturbing. My heart raced. I got up and looked toward the entrance of the room, but the darkness was impenetrable. Once again, the voice spoke, coming from the main entrance. As my eyes adjusted to the lack of light, I began to make out a motionless silhouette standing outside. "Good evening," I replied, my voice hoarse and unsure. I grabbed the flashlight and walked slowly toward the entrance. I pointed the beam of light at the figure, illuminating its face. Its eyes reflected the light, and its skin appeared almost ghostly white. The figure quickly raised a hand to shield its face and turned to the side, as if the light bothered it. Embarrassed, I mumbled an apology and lowered the flashlight. We were very close, separated by only a few meters. Even with the flashlight aimed at the ground, part of the glow still reached his face. He appeared to be a man in his 50s, with a thick beard and dark hair. He wore a straw hat and clothes that, in the darkness, seemed to be all dark tones. His eyes glowed faintly, fixed on mine with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. I asked how I could help him. He took a few seconds before responding, never breaking eye contact. "I'm looking for the owner of the orchard," he said in a low voice. I explained that the owner would only be there in the morning. My discomfort was growing, and I had no idea why someone would show up at that hour. And what are you doing here?" he asked, stepping a bit closer. "I'm taking care of the orchard," I replied, trying to keep the conversation short. That's when Teddy began barking behind me. I turned to calm him down. "May I come in?" the man suddenly asked. Teddy's growling intensified just a few meters away. I didn't know what to say, but something told me letting him in wouldn't be a good idea. "I'm afraid not. Come back tomorrow morning when the owner is here," I said, trying to sound firm, though my voice betrayed my nervousness. He continued talking, mentioning that he had lost a rooster and was looking for it. He said it was a black one, large, with an unusual crow. I replied that I hadn't seen anything like that, and that it would be nearly impossible to find a rooster in the dark, suggesting he return in the morning. The man fell silent, just staring at me. The weight of his gaze was oppressive, sending chills down my spine. I wished him good night, hoping to end the conversation. He took what felt like an eternity to respond. When he finally did, I turned my back and moved away from the entrance. Teddy, however, remained alert, growling and keeping his eyes fixed on where the man had been. An indescribable discomfort settled over me, as if I were carrying a heavy burden on my shoulders. I quickly went back into the house and peeked through the makeshift window. Thankfully, the figure was gone. To be sure, I shone the flashlight where he had been, but no one was there. I couldn't shake how strange it was for someone to show up there at that time, especially looking for a rooster in the middle of the night. I tried convincing myself he might just be a local farmer, perhaps a bit eccentric. I remembered the stories my mother used to tell about my grandfather, who sometimes did unusual things too. But just like the night before, the sense of unease stayed with me for the rest of the night. On the third night, everything seemed finally calm. After dinner, however, I noticed a faint smell in the room, as if something had been burned. I got up from the hammock and started searching for signs of smoke or fire, but I couldn't see any glow or other indications. The smell lingered for several minutes, deeply unsettling me. It was the third consecutive night that something strange had happened. Trying to clear my mind, I went out to walk around the area with the flashlight in hand. If there was a fire, I needed to find it before things got worse. I went into the middle of the mango trees, shining the light on the ground and branches around me. No matter how hard I looked, I couldn't find anything. A sound came with the wind, initially strange, but it soon became clear. It was a rooster's crow, but something was off. The melody was familiar, but the tone was grotesque, deep, as if the bird were out of tune, like the sound of a toy with dying batteries. The noise froze me. It was real, yet it carried a lament, as if the rooster were crying. My legs turned to jelly. I ran back into the room and threw myself into the hammock, trying to calm down. But fear consumed me, filling me with a terrible sense of foreboding. I stroked Teddy, seeking comfort. He sensed my state and nudged his snout against my leg. I was grateful for his company. The rooster's sound persisted. At times it seemed distant, but within seconds it sounded as if it were on the house's roof. It was unbearable, an experience unlike anything I'd ever had. I grabbed my phone and called my mother, pouring out what was happening. I told her I wasn't sure if I could last another night there. She tried to calm me down, saying it was all in my imagination, caused by the isolation and the place's atmosphere. On the fourth night, I decided to try something different. I went into the room earlier and asked my mother to leave me a sheet so I could cover myself completely. I lay in the hammock, with the candles casting flickering light on the walls, and wrapped myself in the sheet, covering even my head. However, Teddy started whimpering. I raised my head and saw him staring at me as if asking me to take off the sheet. Reluctantly, I did. I had made up my mind. If I heard the roosters crow again, I would abandon the orchard and walk away, no matter the distance. Outside, the strong wind rustled the trees, and I could hear mangoes falling on the roof. Teddy was lying beside me, but something woke me, maybe the sound of the wind or the leaves. I looked at the candles. Thankfully, only one of them had gone out. That's when I noticed movement outside. A shadow passed quickly from one side to the other. The smell of burning returned, strong enough to scratch my throat. I stood up slowly, flashlight in hand, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, but I wasn't. The figure crossed in front of me again, this time very close. My heart raced. I turned on the flashlight and lit up the surroundings. The trunks and branches reflected the light, and the mangoes glistened among the leaves. Then, that thing passed by again, closer than before. It wasn't a person. The creature had a body resembling a human's, but its head was something entirely different. Large, curved horns stood out. Its face looked like an animal's, but unidentifiable. What paralyzed me most were its eyes, bulging white, devoid of emotion. They seemed to pierce through me as if they didn't belong to this world. My body went into absolute panic. The thing moved in a horrifying way, with short arms stretched out and clumsy movements. For a few seconds, its eyes locked onto mine, and then it advanced toward me. My heart felt like it was about to burst. The flashlight slipped from my hands and fell to the ground. Trembling, I grabbed it as quickly as I could, but the creature was already too close. Without thinking, I turned and started running. My legs were weak, and with every step I thought I would fall. My heart raced, my breath was ragged, and a cold sensation in my chest left me unable to think. I kept telling myself this couldn't be real. My hand clutched the flashlight so tightly it felt like it would slip away at any moment. Teddy ran alongside me, barking as if trying to scare off the creature. I begged him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. I had to pause for a moment to catch my breath and look back. The path behind me disappeared around a curve, swallowed by darkness. Teddy kept growling, restless, but I knew going back was impossible. The thought of facing that thing again was unimaginable. I kept running, not caring about the distance to the village. The only thing that mattered was getting away from that place. The weight on my shoulders only lifted when I finally reached the national highway. There were no cars passing by, just me and Teddy, standing on the roadside trying to make sense of what had just happened. I arrived home just before dawn, with the first rays of sunlight breaking on the horizon. I knocked on the door, and my father, his face still groggy with sleep, answered. He looked at me, confused, asking what had happened. Still filled with adrenaline, I explained in a rush about the creature I had seen in the orchard. "Are you okay?" he asked, trying to process what I was saying. I told him everything in detail. I spoke of the fear I felt and how surreal it all seemed. I begged him to come back to the orchard with me, at least until the owner arrived. I was terrified, but didn't want to abandon Luciano without explanation. My father agreed, though he was clearly skeptical of my story. On the way, he kept asking what exactly I had seen. At one point, he whispered, "Do you think it was a witch?" We looked at each other, trying to make sense of the idea. As absurd as it seemed, neither of us dismissed it as a possibility. When we arrived at the orchard, the daylight brought some sense of safety. I explained everything again, showing where I had seen the creature, describing the burning smell, the man who had appeared at the door, and of course the horns I had seen on the first night. After hearing everything, my father suggested, maybe it was a Nahual. I had heard stories about such beings, but never gave them much credit. The only thing I was sure of was that what I saw wasn't human. The feeling it gave off was indescribable, and just thinking about it sent chills down my spine. When Luciano arrived, he seemed surprised to see my father. My father explained that he needed me for something and had come to get me. Luciano didn't insist and said goodbye, continuing his work with the mango crates. At that moment, I didn't have the courage to tell him I wouldn't be returning. I was terrified, and the thought of spending another night there was unbearable. So my father went to talk to Luciano and broke the news. When he came back, he admitted he had told him everything I had seen. I felt uneasy, thinking everyone would assume I was making up an excuse to quit the job. But to my surprise, he said they believed the story. According to him, it was because Luciano's family had ties to witchcraft and black magic. For them, transformations and paranormal events were plausible. That revelation unsettled me even more, but at least my decision never to return to the orchard felt justified. I talked to my mother and she shared a similar story about her father in the mountains. She said he was once followed by a creature that chased him through the trees. It left me conflicted. On one hand, I felt relieved that they believed me. On the other, my fear grew, as it meant what I had seen could truly be real. To this day, I can't forget the way that thing moved. The horns seemed fused to its head, as if they were part of its body and not separate. It's an image that continues to haunt me, appearing at unexpected moments, and the weight of that memory never fully fades. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to leave a like. It really makes a difference. Okay, let's continue. Good evening, friends. My name is Abel and I'm originally from the state of Mexico. I want to share with you something disturbing that I experienced back in 2005. At that time, alcohol was a regular part of my routine. It was common for me to head to the tavern on Saturdays after work and drink until I lost track of time. I was rarely alone. My companion Emilio almost always joined me. He didn't work with me, so I usually picked him up from his house, just a few blocks away from mine. One time I didn't have time to go home. I decided to head straight to the bar after work. I started slow with just a beer because I had promised myself I would go a year without touching alcohol. But as you might expect, I couldn't keep that promise. By around 11 at night, I was completely drunk. I remember sitting alone at a table with a bottle of tequila. At one point, I looked up to pour myself another drink and noticed my friend Emilio sitting right across from me. Seeing the state I was in, he let out a loud laugh and said, "My friend, here you are again." We burst into laughter. I explained that I hadn't managed to keep my promise, but that I would try again the next day. "Want a shot?" I asked. He declined, which I found very strange. "Why don't you want to drink? I have an important trip in a few hours and I can't be late," he replied in a more serious tone. We decided to stay there talking. We reminisced about funny moments at parties, like that time we got into a fight 2 against 2. We laughed until we cried. It was already past 4 in the morning when he suggested it was time to leave. I was so drunk I could barely walk, but on the way to my house we sang a few Pedro Infante songs together. Then, all of a sudden, I realized he was gone. I only noticed when I got home, a little after 4:30. My wife greeted me with a scolding. Still irritated, she gave me something to eat and said, "You don't even have the decency to stop by your friend's house." I laughed, thinking it was funny, and told her I'd just spent the night with him at the bar, though I did find it odd that he didn't drink anything. She then looked at me, stunned. "Don't you know? Your friend died yesterday morning. His wake is today. You must have drunk so much that you imagined it all." I was in shock. I insisted that it was impossible because we had talked and sung together that night. I told her to stop talking nonsense, but she kept insisting he had passed away. Overwhelmed by despair and confusion, I ran to his house. There I found his family gathered, and in the yard, a coffin. As I approached, I saw Emilio lying inside, as if he were just sleeping. The sight instantly sobered me up. Unable to hold back, I cried uncontrollably. Once I regained my composure, I noticed something I never told anyone. He was dressed in the same elegant suit he had worn at the bar. After that night, I never touched alcohol again. Before we get to the last story, if you're still here, let me know what time you're watching in the comments. I love seeing who sticks around until the end. Let's not stop now. On to the next. My name is Beatriz. I spent my childhood in a small but warm home in a neighborhood of a tiny town in the interior of Jalisco, here in Mexico. My father, Roberto, was a carpenter who worked in a local workshop, and my mother, Angela, taught children at a primary school. Despite struggling to make ends meet, they always found a way to give me what I needed. Friday nights were special. Homemade tacos and a movie on the old TV in the living room became a tradition. Despite the exhaustion from work, my father never failed to play with me before dinner. We would run around the backyard, and he would lift me into the air while I laughed so hard I could barely breathe. My mother, more reserved, showed her love in subtler ways. She was the one who taught me how to read, even before I started school. We'd sit together on the porch, and she'd show me words in books with colorful pictures. She also gave me my first notebook, explaining that writing was a way to understand myself and the world around me. At school, I was an average student with average grades, but I loved literature and art classes. My neighbor and best friend, Pilar, was my constant companion. We spent hours creating funny stories and planning what our lives would be like in the future. Of course, not everything was perfect. I occasionally fought with my parents, especially when I wanted something they couldn't give me. I'll never forget the time I went days without speaking to my mom because she wouldn't let me go to a party. Now I see it was just her being protective. One of the most memorable moments of my childhood was my 10th birthday. My parents organized a surprise party, a small backyard gathering with my friends. There was a cake, a piñata, and even a plastic pool. It was simple, but I felt like the happiest kid in the world. It was at that party that I met Fabio, the new neighbor who seemed shy and out of place. We made sure to include him in the games, and he soon became part of our group. As I grew older, I started noticing that not everything was harmonious between my parents. Occasionally, I'd hear tense conversations in the kitchen late at night, but they always found a way to reconcile. Until one day, everything changed. It began like any other day. I had breakfast and went to school. Nothing could have prepared me for what awaited me when I returned home. Upon opening the door, the atmosphere felt strange, heavy. I immediately noticed a grocery bag filled with my father's clothes. My stomach churned. Their voices came from the kitchen, raised in tones I had never heard before. When they noticed me, they stopped abruptly. They sent me upstairs to my room without much explanation. My mother's voice trembled, and my father, he yelled at me. That had never happened before. I ran up the stairs with tears stinging my eyes and buried myself under the covers, as if they could shield me from what was happening. The shouting continued to echo through the house, even louder. Words like betrayal, lie, and it's over pierced through even as I covered my ears. I buried my face in the pillow and cried like I never had before. I have no idea how long I stayed there, curled up between tears and tangled thoughts. At some point, the slam of the front door echoed through the house, followed by a suffocating silence. I heard footsteps on the stairs, then a light knock on my bedroom door. It was my mum. I didn't know if I wanted to talk or just disappear. All I wished for was to turn back time, but something told me that wasn't possible anymore. The door opened slowly and the mattress dipped slightly as my mother sat next to me. She placed her hand on my shoulder over the covers. She said we needed to talk. Her voice trembled. Reluctantly, I lowered the blanket and looked at her. Her eyes were swollen and red, and she looked like a completely different person, so vulnerable in a way I never imagined. Between sobs, I asked what was happening. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, and finally said the words that would change everything. "Your father is leaving for a while." Those words hit me like an unexpected blow. My father is leaving? Why? My mind whirled, trying to make sense of it. I asked why, but my mom couldn't bring herself to say anything. Her tears streamed uncontrollably. In that instant, I understood that nothing would ever be the same again. The sense of security and happiness I knew disappeared, leaving only an enormous void. My mind buzzed with questions. What would happen now? What would our lives be like? I looked at my mom, a figure who always seemed indestructible, crumbling before my eyes. The certainty that things were about to change radically scared me more than anything. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions. My father actually left, and our routine was completely altered. Whenever I asked my mom for explanations, she avoided the topic or gave vague answers. "Your father needs some time. It's complicated, Beatrice. You'll understand when you're older." These answers only frustrated me more. As the months went by, a new routine began to take shape. During the week, I stayed with my mom. She did her best to keep things running, but I saw the exhaustion in her eyes and heard her muffled sobs in her room when she thought I wasn't listening. On weekends, I went to my dad's house. At first it was strange. He tried to make up for his absence with gifts and outings, but there was a distance between us that no present could bridge. Then, about a year later, he introduced me to Laura, his new girlfriend, who soon became my stepmother. She was young, full of energy, and always smiling. At first, I hated her, not because she was bad, she was always kind, but because her presence made it even more real that my parents would never get back together. I grew up living in two different worlds. During the week, I was the daughter of a divorced teacher, helping my mom keep things on track, listening to her vent about work and bills. On weekends, I was the daughter of a successful carpenter. My dad opened his own workshop, with a stepmother who tried hard to be my friend, and a dad who seemed lighter than I'd ever seen him. This division between two worlds left me confused. During the week, being with my mom, I imagined what it would be like if we were all together again, me, her, and my dad. But on weekends, seeing my dad smile alongside Laura, I felt a pang of guilt for thinking that way. Over time, I learned to balance these emotions. I realized that loving my dad didn't mean being disloyal to my mom, and accepting Laura didn't mean replacing anyone. But there were still questions no one answered, silences that hid truths. Why did my parents really separate? What happened that night that changed everything? My mom continued to avoid the subject, and my dad, he seemed to have moved on from the past. It was shortly after my 14th birthday that everything started to change again. The relationship between my dad and Laura, which I thought was permanent, also came to an end. It happened on a weekend when I was at his house. I remember seeing Laura packing boxes, taking her things out. My dad wasn't there, probably buried in work at the workshop as he did when he didn't want to deal with problems. When I saw Laura leave for the last time carrying a suitcase, I couldn't hold back. "Why are you two breaking up?" I asked. She stopped, turned slowly, and her eyes were filled with sadness. She took a deep breath before stepping closer. "Beatrice, you're young, but I think you deserve to know the truth. Sometimes the truth is hard, but it makes us stronger." My heart raced. Finally, someone was going to tell me something real. "Your dad cheated on me." The words were spoken simply, without pretense, as if there was no other way to explain them. I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. My dad, the man who always preached about values and respect, him? Why? Without thinking, the words escaped my mouth. Laura shook her head. "I don't know why, dear. Sometimes people do things they can't even explain. But you deserve to know, and you need to remember, you're stronger than you think." She hugged me one last time and left. I stood there, frozen in the doorway, trying to process everything. Then a thought struck me like lightning. If my dad cheated on Laura, did he also cheat on my mom? Could that be the reason for their separation? Suddenly, pieces of the past began to fit together. The muffled arguments I overheard as a child, my mom's silence whenever the topic came up, the heavy look in my dad's eyes when he stared at me. At that moment, I felt like I had aged years in just a few minutes. The innocence I still carried slipped away, replaced by a weight that seemed impossible to bear. But Laura was right. I felt stronger. Not happier, not calmer, but definitely stronger. That's when I made a decision. No more half-truths, no more secrets hanging in the air. It was time for my parents to tell me everything. I began planning how to bring it up while I waited for my dad to come home. I knew it wouldn't be an easy conversation, but for the first time, I was ready to face whatever came, no matter how painful it would be to hear. When my dad finally arrived, I didn't wait a minute. I went straight to the point, throwing all the questions that had been bottled up inside me. About Laura, about the cheating, about the separation with my mom. He seemed caught off guard. His face turned red, his eyes widened for a moment, but then narrowed, filled with anger. "This is not something you should get involved in. These are adult matters," he said, with a defensive and irritated tone that left me stunned. That response hit me like a shock. The kind and loving man I knew seemed to have vanished, replaced by someone distant and hostile. I realized that insisting wouldn't get me anywhere. I sighed deeply and simply asked him to take me home. The drive back was silent, filled with tension. The air felt heavy, loaded with unspoken words. When we finally arrived, my mom immediately noticed that something was wrong. I waited for my dad to leave before telling her everything, what Laura had said, the cheating, and how he reacted to my questions. My mom listened silently, her face marked by a mix of pain and resignation. When I finished, I looked at her and pleaded, "Please tell me the truth, everything." There was a long silence before she spoke. Finally, my mom revealed that my dad had cheated on her, not with Laura, but with another woman. When she mentioned Mrs. Alba's name, I felt a knot form in my stomach. I knew her, everyone knew her. She was a married woman notorious for her extramarital affairs. We sat there side by side without saying anything for a long time. My mind spun, trying to make sense of it all. The father I admired so much, whom I saw as an example, had betrayed not only Laura, but also my mom. It felt like the last piece of my childhood had been ripped away. The image I had of him, and of our family, was irreparably shattered. But somehow I also felt relief. The truth, as harsh as it was finally out in the open. There were no more secrets, no half-truths. I looked at my mom, and for the first time understood the weight she had carried for so long. She had endured it all to protect me, to preserve the relationship I had with my dad. I thanked her, but words seemed insufficient in the face of everything she had been through. She assured me that despite everything, my dad loved me. She said that no matter how I felt at that moment, his love for me was genuine. I knew it would take time to process everything, to decide how to feel. For now, the important thing was that the pieces of the puzzle had finally come together. It didn't take long for my dad to start another relationship, this time with a woman named Paloma. From the first day, it was evident that she didn't like me. Her gaze always carried a hint of disdain, as if anything I did annoyed her. If I left a plate in the sink, she complained. If I spent too much time in my room, she called me antisocial. One time, while I was watching TV in the living room, she walked in with her arms crossed, staring at me like I was an intruder in my own father's house. "Don't you have anything better to do?" she snapped, her tone cold, making me feel small. The relationship with Paloma only reinforced the growing distance between my dad and me. He seemed oblivious to her behavior, and that hurt as much as his own mistakes. Her question was laced with contempt. I was so taken aback that I couldn't respond. Shortly after, my dad entered the room, noticed the tense atmosphere, but instead of intervening, he just sighed and changed the subject as if he wanted to avoid any confrontation. That hurt me deeply. The man who had always been my safe haven now seemed distant, someone who preferred to ignore problems rather than face them. During the weekends I spent at his house, I did everything to avoid Paloma. I locked myself in my room, pretending to study or occupying my time with anything that kept me away from her. My dad noticed but remained silent. He seemed so focused on making that relationship work that, little by little, he pushed me aside. As much as I tried to justify it to myself, saying he deserved to be happy, I couldn't stop the resentment growing inside me. Paloma wasn't just irritating, she was subtly cruel, wounding with disguised comments that went unnoticed by my dad. When she offered something, it always came with a passive-aggressive tone. "Want a piece of cake? Of course, it's probably not as good as your mom's." She made it a point to remind me that I was a guest, someone who didn't belong to that new life. Gradually, these small provocations piled up, and the place that once made me feel safe now felt strange and uncomfortable. I began to dread being there. I missed the time when my parents lived together, when the house was a refuge full of love and harmony. Now, it felt like I had lost not just my family, but also a part of who I was. Over time, my dad changed in ways that scared me. The kind and balanced man he used to be began acting in ways I didn't recognize. Paloma seemed to have a hold on him that I couldn't understand. Suddenly, he was always by her side, even when it was clear she was wrong. Before, he sought to make peace. Now, it seemed all he did was scold me. "Do as Paloma says." He said it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I tried to explain how she treated me, but he refused to listen. It was as if, little by little, I became a burden. What hurt the most was that he stopped picking me up on weekends. Before, I eagerly waited for him on Friday afternoons, ready to enjoy our time together. Now he only showed up if I called, and even then it seemed like an effort for him. "Can't you stay with your mom this time?" he'd ask, as if picking me up was an inconvenience. When he did come, he arrived in a bad mood, complaining about everything during the drive. The simple things we used to do together, going to the park, watching a movie, became rare. The distance between us grew daily, and the father I knew seemed to be getting lost in a place I couldn't reach. He spent so much time with Paloma that there didn't seem to be any room left for me. When we were together, it felt like he could barely tolerate my presence. What hurt most wasn't just the distance, but the feeling of being pushed out of his life, of no longer being a priority. With every cold gesture, every empty look, something inside me broke, and I drifted further from the person I once was. It was in this tangle of pain and confusion that I started to wonder if things would ever go back to the way they were, or if this was the new reality I'd have to learn to live with. Because for the first time I realized that my dad might never be the man he once was. And just when I thought I had reached my limit, things got worse in a way I hadn't imagined. My dad, who had always been a measured man, began drinking. At first it was just a beer here and there, but it quickly became clear that he was spiraling and I didn't know how to handle it. My mom noticed something was wrong even before I said anything. One day, after returning from his house, the fear and discomfort were so evident on me that I couldn't hide it. I confessed everything to her. I told her how Paloma had threatened me, saying that if I didn't obey her, she wouldn't hesitate to hit me. My mom's face filled with fury and concern. It was at that moment that she decided I wouldn't go back to my dad's house. I agreed because fear had already taken over me. Even so, I tried to maintain contact with him. I called occasionally, hoping to hear the dad I used to know, the man who made me feel safe, but most of the time he didn't answer, and when he did, his slurred voice revealed he was drunk. It was like listening to a distorted version of the person I knew. The conversations were short and disconnected, and the next day, he wouldn't even remember we had spoken. Each call seemed to take another piece of what was left of our relationship. I felt like I was losing my dad slowly in small doses until there was nothing left. My mom tried to intervene. She called him, trying to make him understand what was happening, but it seemed like he had completely disconnected. He didn't listen, or maybe he didn't want to. Watching the man who had once been my hero become a shadow of himself was a pain I didn't know how to carry. Unintentionally, I started pulling away. Not because I wanted to, but because every attempt to get closer only hurt me more. My mom was right to protect me, but that didn't make the situation any less painful. I felt anger, sadness, and guilt. A part of me wanted to be there, to believe I could help him, but the truth was that I was just a teenager, and he was drowning in something I didn't know how to fix. I desperately wanted him to get out of that situation, for everything to go back to the way it was. But deep down, I knew that hope was slipping further and further away. And as he distanced himself from me, I felt lost, trying to find my way without the father who had once been my safe haven. Until suddenly the news came. It was as if the world had stopped for a moment, while my mind tried to understand and my heart refused to believe. My dad had died. He had been in an accident while driving drunk. It was my mom who told me, her eyes filled with tears, trying to appear strong, but the pain was evident in her voice. I stood still, as if frozen, unable to process those words. It couldn't be true. It couldn't be him. Life was already hard, but nothing had prepared me for this. Knowing that he was no longer here, that he would never be here again, hit me like a punch to the stomach. The pain was instant, a cruel mix of sadness, anger, and regret. The thought that I would never have the chance to fix what was left unresolved between us was unbearable. I would never hear his voice again, never feel his hug. It felt like time had stopped, leaving me trapped in this moment, trying to understand how to live in a world where he no longer existed. He wasn't perfect, especially in the last few years, but he was still my dad. He was the one who took me on outings, taught me to ride a bike, and was there for the important moments in my life. Now all of that felt so distant, as if it were part of a story I could never revisit. Right after the sadness came anger at him for letting himself be consumed by alcohol, for choosing a path that led him away from me. Anger at him for making decisions that caused all of this. But along with the anger came guilt. I asked myself countless times if I could have done more, if I should have tried harder to help him, as if somehow I was responsible for not saving him. The funeral was a blur. People I barely knew came to hug me and offer condolences while I could barely look at the casket. It was impossible to believe that the body inside was really my dad. Paloma was there, crying dramatically as if she were the biggest victim. That only increased my frustration. But at that moment, nothing else mattered. I just wanted to get through the day, survive the weight of reality, and try to understand how to move forward without him. After the burial, I felt lost. It was as if a part of me had been torn away, leaving a void that seemed impossible to fill. The pain was overwhelming, but I knew that somehow I would have to learn to live with it. Because as much as it hurt, life went on and I had no choice but to keep moving forward, carrying with me the memories of a father I loved deeply, despite his mistakes. Less than a week later, Paloma called me. She said she was getting rid of some of his things, and that if I wanted anything, I should come pick it up. Her coldness hit me hard, but I decided to go. I wanted to find something that reminded me of him, something I could keep close to me, even if it was just a memory. When I entered his room, it was like reliving everything all over again. His scent lingered in the air, his clothes still hung in the closet, and every little detail seemed loaded with memories. With each drawer I opened, the sadness consumed me more, but I needed to find something special, something that was just ours. It was painful, but at the same time it felt necessary, as if this act could help me keep him a little closer, at least in my memory. When I opened one of the deepest drawers, I came across something that piqued my curiosity. At the very back there was a small velvet pouch, heavy and discreet. I picked it up and upon opening it, noticed a dark, coarse powder that intrigued me. Before I could even try to understand what it was, Paloma appeared in the doorway. Her eyes widened when she saw what I was holding. In a quick, panicked motion, she crossed the room and snatched the pouch from my hands. "That's mine!" The tension in her voice was evident. She clutched the pouch to her chest, as if it was something of immense value. I asked why it was among my dad's belongings, but her response was cold and cutting. "That's none of your business." There was no point in insisting. The situation was surreal enough, and I didn't want to prolong the discomfort. I took a few photos of my dad that carried lighter memories, and left the room without another word. Paloma stayed there, clutching the pouch with a closed expression. I no longer had the energy to try to understand her intentions. On the way home, the image of that pouch wouldn't leave my mind. When I arrived, I told my mom everything, detailing the strange powder I found. She listened attentively, but when I mentioned Paloma's reaction, her expression completely changed. A shiver seemed to run through her before she took a deep breath and spoke firmly. "What you saw, Beatrice, was a kind of spell." There was weight in her words. "Paloma might have used black magic against your dad, something to manipulate or destroy his life." The revelation hit me like a punch. Suddenly, so many things began to make sense. My dad's abrupt changes in behavior, his growing distance from me, and his sudden life collapse. It was possible that Paloma was behind it all. But even with this suspicion, I felt powerless. How could I prove something so intangible? Any accusation would be ridiculed. I wanted to act, to find a way to seek justice, but reality was cruel. There was no proof. My mom suggested we let it go. She said that sometimes life takes care of setting things right. What's hers will come back to her one day. Even so, it wasn't easy to accept. As if everything that had already happened wasn't enough, Paloma soon brought another man into the house that had once been my dad's. I found out about it through Donna Carlotta, a sweet and always caring neighbor. She shared the news with sadness, almost unable to believe what Paloma was doing. The speed with which my dad was replaced hurt me deeply. It felt like a deliberate effort to erase his existence, as if he had never been part of that story. What hurt most was realizing that, apart from me and Donna Carlotta, no one seemed to really care. My mom, on the other hand, focused on ensuring my rights were preserved. Since my dad's death, she has been fighting tirelessly in court to secure the share of the inheritance that belongs to me. It's a slow and obstacle-filled battle, especially because Paloma seems determined to complicate every step of the process. I could see the toll this dispute was taking on my mom. She was visibly worn out, but wouldn't let that make her give up. We knew justice was slow, that this process could drag on for years. However, for my mom, it went beyond financial matters. It was also a way to honor my dad's memory. To this day, she remains steadfast in this fight, while I've decided to leave everything in God's hands. I have faith that somehow Paloma will face the consequences of her actions. Sometimes, justice manifests in unexpected ways, and I believe time will bring the necessary balance. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Click the notification bell to stay updated on all future narrations. I post new videos here every day. I hope to see you in the next one. On the screen now, I'm leaving 2 other great videos I know you'll enjoy. See you there.